Before you do anything else, pause for a second and actually think about this. Not casually. Not the way you scroll past headlines. Think about where you were the last time you heard the words, "This could change everything." Because most people don't remember moments like that until it's already too late. They hear something big, something serious, something that sounds like it matters, and then they go right back to their lives. That is exactly how history blindsides people. And right now, there is a pattern forming that almost nobody is paying attention to properly. Not because the information isn't there. It is. It's everywhere. But it's scattered, fragmented, disconnected. You hear one piece about oil, another about war, another about Taiwan, another about food prices, and your brain treats them like separate stories. They're not separate. They are one system, one chain reaction, one set of dominoes already tipping forward. What I'm about to walk you through is not a theory. It's not speculation. It's a map of how everything connects, step by step, in a way that most people never take the time to see. And once you see it, you don't unsee it, because suddenly the random headlines stop being random. They become signals. And here's the uncomfortable part. The signals are getting louder. Right now, at this exact moment, the world is running multiple high-intensity conflicts at the same time. Not isolated incidents, not contained situations, active overlapping pressure points. Ukraine is still grinding forward with no clean resolution. The Middle East is escalating in ways that directly affect global energy. Parts of Africa are destabilizing across multiple regions. Myanmar is locked in internal conflict. These are not small fires. These are sustained burns. Now here's where most people make their first mistake. They assume distance equals safety. It's happening over there. That phrase has probably caused more miscalculations in history than almost anything else. Because over there has a way of becoming right here faster than anyone expects. Let me show you why. There is a single location on this planet that almost nobody talks about enough, but it quietly controls a massive portion of how the modern world functions. A narrow stretch of water, so small you could almost overlook it on a map. And yet, if something goes wrong there, the ripple effects don't stay local. They cascade globally. Because every day, an enormous percentage of the world's energy supply passes through that one choke point. Oil that powers entire nations. Fuel that keeps industries alive. Energy that feeds transportation, food production, manufacturing, everything. Remove that flow or even disrupt it slightly, and you don't just get higher prices, you get instability. And that disruption is not hypothetical anymore. Shipping has already slowed. Costs have already surged. Risk has already been priced in. And here's the part most people don't connect immediately. Energy is not just about gas at the pump. It is embedded in everything. Every product, every shipment, every piece of food that reaches your table has energy baked into its cost. So when energy spikes, everything spikes. Not gradually, not gently, systemically. This is where the second layer begins. Because energy doesn't exist in isolation. It feeds directly into food. And food is where things stop being abstract. You can ignore oil prices. You can ignore geopolitical tensions. You cannot ignore your grocery bill doubling. There are entire regions in the world that rely almost completely on imported food. They don't grow enough locally to sustain their populations. At the same time, they rely heavily on infrastructure that requires constant energy to function, especially water systems. Remove energy stability, and suddenly you're not just dealing with expensive imports. You're dealing with shortages, and shortages don't stay contained. They trigger panic buying. They trigger export restrictions. They trigger supply chain breakdowns. One country tries to protect itself, and in doing so, it creates pressure on another. That pressure spreads. And now you have a situation where multiple systems are under stress at the same time. Energy, food, logistics, finance, all interconnected, all reacting to the same core disruptions. This is how dominoes fall. But we're not even at the most dangerous part yet. Because while all of this is happening on the surface, there is another layer operating underneath it. A layer most people don't like to think about because it feels too extreme, too unlikely, too far removed from everyday life. Nuclear escalation. And the reason people dismiss it is exactly why it becomes dangerous. Because they assume there are safeguards, that there are lines nobody would cross, that there is always a rational off-ramp. But history doesn't run on assumptions. It runs on incentives, pressure, and miscalculation. There is a military concept that has been quietly shaping strategic thinking for years. It's not emotional. It's not irrational. It's calculated. The idea is simple. If a conflict begins to spiral out of control in a conventional sense, one side may escalate dramatically, not to win outright, but to force the other side to stop. Not because they want total destruction, but because they believe a controlled shock could end the conflict faster. Think about that for a second. A controlled shock. That is the kind of logic that only works on paper. Because once escalation crosses a certain threshold, control becomes an illusion. Every response invites another response. Every move tightens the chain. And right now, multiple nuclear-capable nations are operating in overlapping spheres of tension. Not in isolation, not separated by clear boundaries. Interconnected. Military assets are moving. Strategic posturing is increasing. Communication between major powers is not improving. In some cases, it's deteriorating. And when communication breaks down, the margin for error disappears. The most dangerous outcomes in history are rarely intentional. They are accidents layered on top of tension. Misread signals. Overreactions. Delayed responses. Now add that to everything we just talked about. So, energy pressure, food pressure, economic pressure, regional conflicts expanding, and on top of all of it, reduced trust and communication between the most powerful actors in the system. This is not a stable environment. And while all of this is unfolding, there is another piece quietly building in the background. One that doesn't dominate headlines every day, but has the potential to shift the entire global balance overnight. Taiwan. This is where things become even more complex. Because Taiwan is not just a geographic issue. It is a technological and economic nerve center. A massive portion of the world's advanced semiconductor production runs through that region. Semiconductors are not optional. They are in everything. Phones, vehicles, infrastructure, defense systems, medical equipment. Disrupt that supply, and you don't just get inconvenience. You get paralysis across multiple industries. Now, imagine a scenario where tensions escalate there, while everything else is already under strain. You don't get isolated consequences, you get compounding ones. Countries begin to reassess their positions. Alliances get tested. Supply chains fracture further. Markets react not just to what is happening, but to what might happen next. And that might is enough to trigger real-world effects. Because markets move on expectation, governments move on risk calculations, militaries move on perceived threats. Everything accelerates. At this point, you might be wondering why all of this seems to be happening at once. Why multiple regions are heating up simultaneously? Why systems that held for decades are now showing cracks? The answer is uncomfortable but simple. The global system that has been in place for the last several decades is under pressure from multiple directions at the same time. It was never perfect, but it created a certain level of predictability. Trade flowed. Security guarantees existed. There were rules, even if they were unevenly applied. Now those rules are being tested. Different powers are pushing in different regions. Not randomly, but strategically. Each move creates pressure elsewhere. Each pressure point weakens the overall structure slightly. And when enough pressure builds up, the system doesn't bend. It shifts. Countries are reacting to that shift in very visible ways. Increasing military spending, reassessing alliances, preparing for scenarios they previously considered unlikely. These are not symbolic actions. They are signals. Signals that decision makers are no longer assuming stability. They are preparing for instability. And here is where everything comes together. Because once enough actors begin preparing for worst-case scenarios, those scenarios become more likely, not less. Preparation changes behavior. Behavior changes outcomes. And outcomes reinforce the need for further preparation. It becomes a loop, a self-reinforcing cycle. And cycles like that are very difficult to stop once they reach a certain point. So what happens next? Not in theory, not in speculation, in sequence. First, continued pressure on energy markets. Not necessarily a collapse, but sustained volatility. Prices that don't settle. costs that remain elevated. Second, that pressure feeds directly into food systems. Higher production costs, higher transportation costs, reduced supply in certain regions. Third, regional conflicts continue to expand indirectly, not always through direct confrontation, but through proxies, alliances, and economic measures. Fourth, financial systems begin to feel the strain. Investment flows shift. Markets react more sharply to uncertainty. Stability becomes harder to maintain. And throughout all of this, the background risk of escalation remains. Not constant, not guaranteed, but present. And presence is enough, because systems don't need certainty to react. They react to probability. Now here's the part most people won't like. None of this requires a single dramatic event to unfold. It doesn't require one massive trigger. It can happen gradually, step by step, adjustment by adjustment, until one day, things that used to feel stable no longer do. And people look back and try to pinpoint the exact moment it all shifted. But by then, the dominoes have already fallen too far. So the real question isn't whether something is happening. It already is. The question is whether enough people are paying attention early enough to understand it. Because awareness changes how you interpret signals. It changes how you prepare. It changes how you respond. And right now, the biggest risk is not panic. It's indifference. Because indifference delays reaction, and delayed reaction reduces options. And when options narrow, outcomes become harder to control. This is not about fear, it's about clarity, seeing the connections. Understanding the sequence. Recognizing that what looks like separate events are actually part of the same system moving in real time. Because once you understand that, you stop asking if it affects you, and you start asking how soon. And this is where most people make the second mistake. The first mistake is thinking it's over there. The second is thinking there's still plenty of time. Because time doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes quietly. Slowly at first, then all at once when the system reaches a tipping point. Right now, the world is not waiting for a single explosion of chaos. It's absorbing pressure. And pressure, when it builds long enough without release, doesn't stay contained. It looks stable right up until the moment it isn't. Think about how quickly things can change when multiple systems are already stretched. One disruption in energy flows forces countries to compete harder for supply. That competition drives prices higher. Higher prices force governments to make difficult decisions. Some subsidize. Some ration, some restrict exports. Every one of those decisions has consequences beyond their borders. And here's the part that most people underestimate. Governments do not act in isolation. They react to each other. When one country restricts exports to protect its own population, another country suddenly finds itself short. That country reacts. And now you have a chain reaction of defensive decisions that collectively make the global situation worse. This is how scarcity spreads. Not because there isn't enough in total, but because access becomes uneven. And uneven access creates instability. Now layer that with something even more sensitive: trust. Global systems don't just run on resources. They run on trust between nations, agreements, expectations, predictability. When that trust weakens, countries start acting more aggressively to secure their own interests. Not necessarily because they want conflict, but because they fear being left exposed. And fear is one of the most powerful accelerators in geopolitics, because fear compresses decision-making. It reduces patience. It increases the willingness to take risks that wouldn't have been considered under normal conditions. And when multiple countries are operating under that same pressure at the same time, the system becomes volatile. Now think about what happens when volatility meets miscalculation. A single misinterpreted signal, a delayed response, an action that was meant to deter but is perceived as escalation. This is how situations spiral. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because once momentum builds, it becomes difficult to slow down. And here's where things become even more intense. Because while governments and institutions are dealing with these pressures, everyday people start to feel the effects in ways that don't immediately seem connected. Prices rise, availability shifts, uncertainty increases, and uncertainty changes behavior. People start holding on to resources longer. They spend differently. They invest differently. They prepare differently. That shift in behavior feeds back into the system. Because economies are driven by collective behavior. When enough individuals change how they act, the system itself starts to change. Now imagine that happening globally. Millions of people adjusting at the same time, not because they were told to, but because they feel something is off. That's when you start to see deeper shifts, not just in markets, but in confidence. And confidence is everything. Because once confidence drops below a certain threshold, stability becomes fragile. And fragile systems don't need a massive shock to break. They just need one more push. This is where we need to talk about something that almost nobody wants to acknowledge openly. The idea that systems can fail gradually without a clear moment of collapse. Because people are conditioned to look for dramatic turning points. A headline, a declaration, a clear signal that something has changed. But real-world systems don't always work like that. Sometimes the change is silent. It shows up as longer wait times, higher costs, more frequent disruptions, small inconsistencies that slowly become the new normal. And by the time people realize the system has fundamentally shifted, they've already adapted to it without noticing. That is one of the most dangerous transitions because it doesn't trigger urgency. It normalizes instability. Now connect that back to everything we've been talking about. Energy disruption, food pressure, regional conflicts, military buildup, economic strain, reduced communication between major powers. Each one on its own is manageable. Together, they create a system that is far less predictable than it appears on the surface. And unpredictability changes how decisions are made. Leaders begin preparing for scenarios they hope never happen. Militaries increase readiness. Alliances become more rigid or, in some cases, more fragile. And every preparation made for a worst-case scenario subtly increases the likelihood of that scenario becoming real. Because preparation changes posture. Posture influences perception. Perception drives response. And response creates new realities. Now here's where it gets even more critical. Because while all of this is happening at a global level, there is a psychological effect happening at an individual level. People begin to sense that something is off, but they can't fully articulate what it is. So they default to one of two reactions. They either ignore it completely and continue as if nothing is changing, or they become overwhelmed and assume there is nothing they can do. Both reactions lead to the same outcome: inaction. And inaction in a changing system is not neutral. It leaves you unprepared. Because whether you choose to pay attention or not, the system continues moving. Now let's bring this back to the core idea. The dominoes. Because once you start to see them clearly, you realize something important. They don't all fall at once. They fall in sequence, and the sequence matters. The first domino creates pressure. The second amplifies it. The third spreads it. The fourth destabilizes surrounding systems. And by the time you reach the later stages, the system is no longer reacting. It's transforming. And transformation is much harder to reverse than disruption. So what should you actually be watching? Not headlines, not isolated events, patterns. Watch how energy prices behave over time, not just in spikes, but in sustained trends. Watch how food availability shifts, not just globally, but locally. Watch how governments communicate, especially what they don't say. Watch how markets react to uncertainty, not just in drops, but in volatility. Watch how alliances behave under pressure. And most importantly, watch how quickly things change once they start moving. Because speed is the clearest indicator that a system is under stress. Slow systems are stable. Fast systems are reacting. And reactive systems are harder to control. Now here's the part that matters most. This is not about predicting a specific outcome. It's about understanding the environment. Because once you understand the environment, you stop being surprised by changes. You start recognizing them early. And early recognition gives you something extremely valuable. Time. Not unlimited time, but enough to think clearly. Enough to adjust. Enough to make decisions before the system forces them on you. Because that's the difference. When systems are stable, you choose your actions. When systems are unstable, your actions are chosen for you by circumstances. And right now, we are moving from one state to the other. Gradually, quietly, but undeniably. So the real takeaway is not fear. It's awareness. Because awareness is what separates reaction from preparation. It allows you to see the dominoes before they fall too far. It allows you to understand that what looks like separate events are actually connected movements within the same system. And once you understand that, you stop asking if something will happen. You start asking how different outcomes could unfold. And that shift in thinking is everything. because it moves you from passive observer to active thinker, from someone who reacts to headlines to someone who interprets patterns. And in a world that is becoming more complex, more interconnected, and more unpredictable, that difference matters more than ever. Because at the end of the day, history doesn't just happen to people. It unfolds around them while they decide whether or not to pay attention. And right now, the signals are there, clearer than most people realize, stronger than most people are willing to admit. The only question left is whether enough people will see them in time. Because once the pace accelerates, once the system starts moving faster, once the dominoes pick up speed, there is a point where observation turns into reaction. And that point is always closer than it seems. So don't look away. Not because you need to be afraid, but because understanding what's happening gives you something most people won't have when things start to shift: perspective. And in moments of uncertainty, perspective is one of the few advantages that actually matters. Because when you can see the system clearly, you're not guessing. You're interpreting. You're connecting. You're thinking ahead. And that changes everything. This story isn't finished. It's still unfolding in real time. Every decision, every movement, every shift adding another piece to the pattern. And patterns, once they fully form, are impossible to ignore. So pay attention. Not casually, not occasionally, consistently. Because the people who understand what's happening early are the ones who navigate it best when it matters most. And the ones who don't, are the ones who spend the most time asking what went wrong after it already has.